Okay, welcome to your biology notes for section 4 of chapter 12. This section is over early single-celled organisms. We're only going to cover the first two objectives in this video today. We're going to pick up the other one later in class. But first you're going to be able to recognize the role that microbes played in shaping life on Earth. And then secondly, we need to summarize that theory of endosymbiosis. Remember in the notes yesterday, in that last section, we talked about how it was a lot more likely that simple would come before complicated. So in this section, we're going to talk a lot about how likely the first living things were prokaryotes, and eukaryotes would have evolved from those prokaryotes. Because you are a lot more complicated than a bacteria cell, it's a lot more likely that they came first and we came second. Okay, so this first slide, microbes have changed physical and chemical composition of the Earth. Some of the major things that they've done, I remember we talked about how there was no oxygen in early Earth's atmosphere. The first prokaryotes would have to be anaerobic since there was no oxygen. We couldn't have existed yet. Earliest known fossils are those of cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria are photosynthesizing bacteria, right? That cyan is that blue-green color that they have, and you know that green color is usually from chlorophyll. Those are photosynthesizing bacteria. Those would have been the first living things on this planet. They lived in colonies and formed these things called stromatolites, and those stromatolites are actually our first fossils. They're the oldest fossils that we've ever found. And those stromatolites are about 3.5 billion years old. So that's about as old as we think life is on this planet. That's the oldest evidence for life. They were prokaryotes, not eukaryotes, right? And they were anaerobic, but they were photosynthesizing bacteria. So this whiteboard question here is just asking, why would that photosynthesis be important for subsequent evolution? Why would that be important to you? I'm guessing you could probably get an answer to that. This next slide is talking about eukaryotes. So remember, we think that eukaryotes would have come from prokaryotes. The oldest fossils for eukaryotes are 1.5 billion years old. So prokaryotes, as far as we know, have been around for 2 billion years longer than we have. So definitely prokaryotes first, eukaryotes second. Those original eukaryotes would have still been single-celled organisms, still very, very simple, not quite a complicated organism like yourself yet. But those single cells probably evolved from prokaryotes some way, somehow. And that's this theory of endosymbiosis that we need to go through. Endosymbiosis is just basically saying that you would have had separate free living cells that may have combined to form a eukaryote. So you have this one bacteria cell here, and you have another, possibly a cyanobacteria, a photosynthesizing bacteria that can combine. Basically, that bigger cell just Pac-Mans and eats that smaller cell, so that you have that smaller cell within the bigger cell. And that smaller cell becomes part of the bigger cell over time. They evolve together to become basically the same organism, and then that smaller cell becomes a organelle inside of that bigger cell. And if this is a cyanobacteria that can do photosynthesis, we're basically assuming that that photosynthesizing bacteria is what evolved into a chloroplast today. So we know that plant cells and other photosynthesizing eukaryotes have chloroplasts, those chloroplasts may have originally been some kind of cyanobacteria that just evolved in conjunction with that larger cell to become part of that larger cell. So it's a fairly simple theory. Multiple prokaryotes would combine to form a eukaryote. A larger cell engulfs and brings in that smaller cell, and then that smaller cell becomes an organelle over the process of thousands and thousands and millions of years. Okay, we have evidence to support this because Lynn Margulis found that chloroplasts and mitochondria have their own DNA, and it's circular DNA, which specifically tells us that it was a prokaryote. Remember when we talked about bacteria before? They have circular DNA, you have linear DNA. And then chloroplasts and mitochondria also have to replicate separately in your cells before you can make a new cell. So each new cell that you're going to make, you have to replicate your mitochondria first, and they do that on their own. So since they kind of do their own thing inside of you, it's theoretically possible that at one point in time they could do their own thing on their own, completely separate from you. Chloroplasts probably would have been cyanobacteria. Mitochondria would have just been some aerobic bacteria using oxygen to burn fuel to get its energy. When that was put in your cells, that's what became our mitochondria. So again, both things likely were their own entity at some point because they can both replicate separately. They both have circular DNA, just like a prokaryote does. But once they became part of that larger cell, they lost their identity and they just became those organelles that we have today. So we think that eukaryotes came from prokaryotes, and this is that basic theory that covers that idea. Again, there's lots of support when you know that chloroplasts and mitochondria have their own DNA. So they're basically their own cell, they're their own entity. They just happen to be inside of your cells. They replicate separately and everything. So we're pretty sure that this theory is sound. There's a lot of evidence to support it. Prokaryotes could have turned into eukaryotes under a process, something like this. All right, whatever's left in your notes, we're going to cover later in class. So you're done with this for right now. Make sure you remember to take your quiz.